What happens when a quiet old man with a broken coffee cart becomes the reason an entire town finds its courage again? And what if the only person willing to fight for him is a stranger with no name and a past he doesn't speak of? Before we dive into this powerful story, don't forget to share the video, and subscribe to our channel. We're on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support is what keeps us going, helping us bring you even more inspiring content like this. Silvervale wasn't always like this. Folks used to sit out on their porches and wave to neighbors. Children rode their bikes up and down Main Street, laughing as the sun dipped behind the hills. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else's memory. Now, the streets were quieter than they should be, and eyes darted away too quickly. People whispered instead of spoke. They moved with caution, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Lucas knew that kind of silence. He carried it in his bones. Most mornings, before the sun fully rose, he would wheel his old coffee cart out from behind the abandoned hardware store where he slept. The cart was more rust than metal now, with one wobbly wheel that leaned left, no matter how often he tried to fix it. A faded sign hung on the front that read, "Coffee, hot and kind." Lucas wasn't much for talking, he believed in doing. And every day, no matter the weather or how empty his pocket was, he brewed his coffee and gave it away to whoever needed a warm moment. Some paid what they could, a few coins, a crumpled bill, sometimes just a thank you. That was enough for Lucas, enough to keep going. People respected him in that quiet way folks respect someone who's been through a lot. He didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, and never missed a day. But not everyone shared that respect. The night serpents came into Silvervale a few years back. At first, people thought they were just passing through, leather jackets, loud bikes, rough talk, but they didn't leave. They bought out the gas station, took over the bar, and before long, they had the sheriff in their pocket. Most folks figured it was better to stay out of their way. For Lucas, that wasn't really an option. Every month, like clockwork, a few of them would show up, smirking as they leaned against his cart, demanding their protection fee. He never had much to give. Some months, nothing at all. That didn't stop them from knocking over the cart or taking what little money he had. Once, they smashed his coffee pot right in front of him and laughed as he picked up the pieces. Still, the next morning, Lucas was back. Same place, same cart, same quiet nod to those who stopped by. People noticed. They might have been afraid to stand with him, but they noticed. It was on one of those cold, gray mornings that a man stopped at Lucas's cart. He didn't say much, just pointed to a cup and waited. Lucas poured him a fresh brew, the kind he saved for early risers. The man had tired eyes and carried himself like someone who'd seen too much. His clothes were plain, his beard short and rough, and his hands, they weren't the hands of a drifter. They were steady, alert. He handed Lucas a folded bill, more than anyone ever paid, then stepped back, sipping slowly. Lucas didn't ask his name. That wasn't his way, but something about the man stuck with him. The silence around him didn't feel empty, it felt contained. After the man walked away, Lucas looked at the bill, a 20. He smiled, a little surprised. Then he looked down the street where the man had gone and whispered to no one in particular, "Hope travels quietly these days." By mid-morning, Lucas was back to his routine, offering second cups and short nods. Kids passed by on their way to school, waving. An older woman dropped a few coins in his jar and said her usual, "You're the warmest part of this town, Lucas." He gave a soft chuckle and replied, "Just trying to keep the steam rising." What he didn't see was the man, John Wick, standing quietly in the alley across the street, watching, blending in with the broken buildings like a shadow. He wasn't here for anyone, but now maybe he had a reason to stay just a little longer. As the day went on and the clouds rolled in low and heavy, the town seemed to settle back into its uneasy rhythm. People moved fast between places, heads down, doors quickly shut behind them. But Lucas stayed out just a little longer than usual that day, pouring coffee into cracked cups, wiping down his dented cart, humming a tune that had no words. He didn't know why, but something felt different in the air. Like maybe someone had struck a match in a dark room, and even though it hadn't caught fire yet, the warmth was coming. It started with the sound of engines deep growling, Drawn-out roars that echoed off the old buildings like a bad memory returning. Folks knew that sound too well. It meant the night serpents were back in town. Lucas was setting out the sugar packets and stirring sticks like he did every morning. His cart stood at the usual corner near the faded post office. The early sun hadn't yet climbed above the hills, and the air still held a sharp chill. But the warmth in his coffee and the quiet rhythm of routine helped ease the cold. A couple of regulars came by Mrs. Jennings, who always brought her own ceramic mug, and Benny, the handyman who paid in spare change and stories. Lucas handed them their cups with a nod, never needing to say much. Then came the growl of tires. 3 bikes pulled up, side by side, cutting into the calm like knives. One of the riders, a broad man with sun-leathered skin and a snake tattoo that wrapped around his neck, climbed off and walked toward Lucas. His name was Deke, one of Rex's lieutenants, and he had the kind of face that didn't change expression much, just narrowed eyes and a tight jaw. "You know what day it is," Deke said, tapping the edge of the cart with his gloved fingers. "Rent's due, old man." Lucas didn't flinch. He simply looked up from the cup he was filling and said, "I don't have anything this month." Deke smiled without humor. "That so?" Without warning, he grabbed the metal thermos and slammed it against the ground. The steel crumpled with a sharp clang. Coffee spilled across the pavement like a small flood of warmth wasted. Another biker kicked the cart's front wheel, knocking it sideways. Cups and spoons scattered. Before Lucas could say a word, Deke shoved him hard, sending him stumbling into the alley wall. The others laughed as he hit the ground, his knees scraping the cracked concrete. One of them leaned over and whispered something, but Lucas didn't hear it. His ears were ringing and his heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of helplessness. Across the street, behind a half-shuttered window, someone was watching. John Wick stood in the shadows of the empty laundromat, hands in his coat pockets, eyes still. He didn't blink as Deke and the others mounted their bikes and revved their engines. The noise thundered through the quiet streets. Then they were gone, just like that. Lucas stayed on the ground a moment longer than usual before pushing himself up. He didn't look around for help. He knew better. The few people nearby had all turned away, pretending to be busy, pretending not to see. That night, the town felt even smaller than usual. John walked its narrow paths alone, silent, like he was measuring something. He passed the hardware store, its windows dark and dusty. He walked past the bar, where the gang sat loud and loose, tossing bills on the table like they owned the place. Sheriff Briggs was in the back booth, drinking whiskey and laughing at something a biker said. They didn't hide their dealings. There was no reason to. At the corner grocery, John saw a shopkeeper counting money with shaking hands. A serpent stood nearby, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. The shopkeeper handed over the bills with his head bowed. When the serpent left, the man exhaled slowly and locked the door, even though it wasn't closing time. Silver Vale wasn't a town anymore. It was a cage. Later that night, beneath a flickering street lamp near the edge of town, John worked alone. The tools he'd picked up from the old supply shed behind the train yard were basic, but he knew how to use them. Quietly, he adjusted the frame of Lucas's coffee cart, straightening the bent metal. He replaced a busted wheel and reinforced the back panel. A new thermos heavy-duty steel solid was placed on top. He wiped down the surfaces, then left a folded scrap of paper held under a spoon. By morning, the sun hadn't yet risen when Lucas stepped out behind the hardware store and found the cart. He stared for a long time, barely breathing. His fingers touched the smooth surface of the new thermos. He noticed the repaired wheel, the fresh welds. He unfolded the note. In messy handwriting it read, "Don't stop. They're the ones who should be afraid." Lucas looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was still sleeping. He didn't say a word, but something in his eyes changed. The kind of change that doesn't show on your face but settles in your chest, like something breaking loose after being stuck for too long. He brushed off the cart and got to work. That was all, but it was enough. Later that day, the bikers saw the cart, shiny and straight, back in its spot like nothing had happened. They didn't smile this time. Deke narrowed his eyes. One of the others muttered, "Someone's helping him?" They went straight to Rex. "Rex, the leader of the Night Serpents, wasn't the kind of man you argued with. He used to work in places no one talked about, places where rules didn't apply. Now he sat behind the bar's backroom desk, flipping a coin between his fingers. When Deke told him what happened, Rex didn't raise his voice. He just stopped the coin midair and stared at it for a few seconds. "Then we send a clearer message," he said quietly. Deke shifted uncomfortably. "You want us to hit the cart again?" Rex shook his head. "No, this time we burn the idea." Lucas wasn't the problem. Lucas was the symbol. Someone had chosen him. That couldn't be allowed. Across town, John cleaned his hands with a rag. He'd been silent long enough. The violence wasn't new to him, but this time it felt different. This wasn't a job. It wasn't about revenge or duty. It was something quieter, simpler. A man was being punished for holding on to decency. Maybe the town hadn't asked for help, but John was going to give it anyway. And this time, there would be no warning. The sky hadn't yet turned blue when Lucas stepped out from the back of the hardware store. The morning air was colder than usual, with a bite that crept under his coat and settled in his chest. He clutched the sides of his collar and walked slower than normal, something in his gut dragging behind him. As he neared the alley leading to Main Street, the scent hit him first. It wasn't the smell of fresh coffee or yesterday's old grounds. It was something sharp and bitter, burned plastic. Smoke? He turned the corner and his legs stopped moving. His cart was gone. Or rather, what remained of it stood in a pile of twisted metal and scorched wood. Flames had long since died out, but the smoke still curled from what was left of the wheels. The handles were nothing but blackened stumps, and the side panel, the one with the faded words he painted years ago, had been torn off and tossed aside. The wall next to it bore fresh spray paint in red, thick strokes that dripped like blood down the bricks. "Last warning, leave." Lucas didn't speak. He didn't shout or cry. He just stood there, hands limp at his sides, and stared at what used to be the only thing he owned. Around him, the town began to stir. Windows cracked open, blinds shifted. A few faces peered out, but no one stepped forward. A car passed slowly, and the driver, Sheriff Briggs, looked once, then pressed the gas and disappeared around the corner. Lucas lowered himself to his knees, one hand resting on the sidewalk to steady himself. The air was still, but everything inside him spun. He wasn't surprised. Not really, but he had hoped. And now that hope felt like smoke in his lungs. He stayed like that longer than he realized, until the sun was already stretching across the pavement. Eventually he stood up, turned around, and walked away without a word. By nightfall, the alley was empty except for the charred pieces no one bothered to clean. Lucas sat in his makeshift tent behind the store, staring at a patch of worn canvas above his head. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't moved much since morning. That's when he heard footsteps, quiet, deliberate, approaching the flap of his tent. Lucas didn't lift his head, expecting maybe a stray cat or the wind playing tricks. But someone ducked inside. John Wick didn't say anything at first. He simply set a bundle wrapped in canvas on the floor between them. When he unwrapped it, Lucas saw tools, 2 solid wheels, and a few planks of wood already sanded and shaped. On top, a small metal bracket that looked like it came from the hardware store's back shelf. Lucas looked up. His voice was rough. "Why help me?" John met his eyes for the first time, not just looking at him, seeing him. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind. And to still believe it matters," that was all. The tent grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. There was something in the air, something unfinished. A beginning buried inside an end. After John left, Lucas didn't sleep. He sat up, turning the metal piece over in his hand, then ran his fingers along the wood grain of a cart panel. The pain from the morning still throbbed, but something else stirred underneath it, the slow return of will. Meanwhile, in a corner of Silver Vale few dared enter after dark, John moved with purpose. He watched the serpents from a distance, the way they laughed too loud, how they always traveled in threes, the way their hands always hovered close to the handles of their knives or the bulges in their jackets. He traced their patterns, noted who came and went. He mapped exits, timed patrols. Learned their rhythm like a hunter learning the steps of prey. A few nights later, Tommy Ray, one of the younger collectors, known for shaking down high schoolers for lunch money, didn't show up at the bar. The next morning, his bike was found behind the feed store, still upright, no sign of Tommy. The day after that, another serpent named Jace was found tied to his own bike, parked just outside town limits. His arm hung at an odd angle, and his lips were swollen from where someone had silenced his shouting with a cloth gag. Pinned to his chest was a folded note, short and clear. No more taxes. Word spread fast. Not because people talked openly, they didn't, but there was something about fear when it turned around and started looking in the other direction. The weight in the air shifted. The serpents weren't invisible anymore. They were being watched, targeted, pushed back. In the back room of the bar, Rex sat in his usual chair, the one with the cracked leather and cigarette burns on the arms. He didn't say much as Deke paced the floor, throwing out guesses about who it could be. The sheriff? Some outsider? A rival gang? Rex lit a match with one hand and held it up in front of his eyes. "They're trying to make a statement," he said. But they forgot something. He let the flame burn low, nearly touching his fingertips before he snuffed it out. "You don't leave a message unless you want an answer." He stood slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Find out who it is. I don't care how. And when you do, break him," he paused, glancing toward the window, "and make an example of the coffee man." Back in his tent, Lucas was already sketching on a scrap of cardboard measurements for a cart frame. Ideas for cup holders, maybe even a spot to store sugar packs properly this time. He didn't know what was coming next. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to stay. It didn't start with noise. Not with explosions or sirens or screams. It started with a whisper barely spoken, passed like a secret between two people at the edge of a conversation. Someone had slashed the tire of the Serpent's supply truck parked behind the bar. The same truck they used to run their pickups between towns. No one saw who did it, but the cut was clean, sharp, straight through the thickest part of the rubber. The next day, their backup generator used to power the bar when the grid failed was found broken open. Wires yanked, battery pack gone. One of the lieutenants, Raiden, called it sabotage. Deke wasn't so calm, he called it a threat. Then came the box. It arrived without a name, sitting on the table in Rex's private office behind the bar. He opened it with one hand while finishing a beer with the other, expecting maybe a package from a contact or a delivery someone forgot to log. Inside were photographs. Black and white. Crisp, too crisp. There were shots of Rex shaking hands with a man known to be tied to a cartel down south. There were images of two lieutenants moving boxes out of a stolen trailer. A few of the pictures showed them with unregistered weapons, counting money, handing off bags in the alley behind the diner. None of them had any idea these photos had ever been taken. Rex flipped through the stack slowly. His fingers didn't shake, but his jaw tightened. When he got to the last photo, one of him alone in the gas station parking lot at midnight, lighting a cigarette, he let out a low breath and placed it carefully on the table. Someone was watching. Someone knew how to hunt. Inside the gang, tension started to spread. The cocky laughs turned into side glances. Guns got loaded sooner. Nobody moved alone after sundown. But Rex had his own idea about what was going on. He thought Lucas was the leak. The old man was being helped by someone who knew how to stay hidden, how to send messages without saying a word. And that made Lucas dangerous. 2 days later, in broad daylight, Lucas was at the market, handing out cups of fresh brew from a folding table he'd borrowed while rebuilding the cart. People passed by, offering shy smiles and nods of encouragement. For the first time in months, someone slipped him a small envelope of cash and told him, "Keep going." Then came the truck. It pulled up without warning, not from the main road, but from a side path near the alley. 2 men jumped out. They didn't speak. They grabbed Lucas by both arms before he could even set down the pot. A woman screamed. Someone dropped a basket of onions. But no one ran forward. By the time anyone thought to react, Lucas was in the back of the pickup, hood over his head, and the truck was gone. Within the hour, the news reached the sheriff. Briggs leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling, and said, "Wrong place, wrong time," before closing his door and locking it from the inside. That evening, just before the last bit of light disappeared over the hills, the sheriff's office door creaked open. John walked in slow, calm, He didn't speak, didn't need to. He approached the desk and placed a phone on the wooden surface in front of the sheriff. On the screen, paused and waiting, was a video clip silent but crystal clear. It showed Briggs leaning across a table, counting money. Rex sat across from him, pushing a thick envelope his way. John hit play. The sheriff's face paled as the room filled with the quiet buzz of the video. He didn't touch the phone, didn't look up. When John turned to leave, the door shut behind him without a word. John didn't waste time. He left the station and disappeared into the night. The old steel mill sat just beyond the train tracks, broken down and rusted from years of rain and neglect. It hadn't operated in decades. Kids used to dare each other to go inside, but not anymore. Now it was where the serpents went when they didn't want to be found. John knew the place before he got there. He'd studied the layout, the guard shifts, the weak spots in the fence. He moved through the shadows like water, silent and sure. One by one, the men stationed outside were taken out quietly. A snap of breath, a shift in the gravel, then stillness. No alarms, no mess. Inside the mill, Lucas sat tied to a chair beneath a flickering light. His face was bruised, lips split, one eye swollen nearly shut. But he was conscious, breathing. He hadn't said a word since they brought him in. John slipped through the side entrance, his steps timed with the creaks of the wind. He moved past an old boiler, ducked under a rusted beam, and paused at the door leading to the center room. 2 guards waited outside. It didn't take long. When he stepped into the room, Lucas lifted his head slightly, blinking through the haze of pain. John moved to him without a word, cutting through the ropes. As he untied the last knot, Lucas whispered, "Why risk your life?" John paused only a moment before answering. "Because if I don't, they'll keep burning everything that's good." Then the alarm tripped. Someone outside must have found a body, or a camera blinked at the wrong moment. Shouts rang out. Boots pounded the ground. Flashlights cut through the dark like blades. John turned fast, gun in hand. The silence was over. What followed wasn't chaos. It was controlled, deliberate violence. John moved like a storm that knew where every bolt of lightning would land. His shots were clean, his aim true. No wasted motion, no second chances. Rex, hearing the gunfire, escaped through a back exit with Deke covering him. They didn't wait to see who had come. They didn't stop to finish what they started. By the time the dust settled, John stood in the main room, breath steady, clothes stained with the night's work. Lucas leaned against the chair, dazed but safe. Before sunrise, they were gone from the mill. Lucas was back in town before the birds began their songs. John left him at the alley behind the hardware store, not saying anything as he helped him inside his tent and laid a blanket over his shoulders. Across town, whispers started again, but different this time. Someone had hit the serpents hard. Someone had taken on the gang that ruled with fear, and they had done it all to save the man who poured coffee with a smile, even when no one smiled back. It began with murmurs over coffee and glances exchanged across porches. What once was a town too scared to speak had found its voice soft at first, but steady. The morning after the rescue, word had already circled through barbershops, churches, and grocery aisles. Folks didn't name names. They didn't have to. Everyone understood that something in Silver Vale had shifted. The weight of fear that sat heavy on every doorstep had begun to lift, as if someone had cracked open a window in a room long sealed shut. Still, not everyone was pleased. In the back room of the bar, Rex paced like a caged animal. His pride had been bruised in front of his men, and he wore it like an open wound. Some had left town quietly, taken their vests with them. Others stuck around, but not for loyalty. They were waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Rex didn't care about loyalty anymore. He cared about control. He gathered the ones who remained fewer now, but meaner. The ones who stayed weren't looking to talk things through. They wanted blood, and Rex gave them a plan. The market. "This Saturday," he said, tapping the tip of his knife against the map of the town center, "when everyone's gathered. We light the square and make it clear who still owns this place." One of the younger bikers shifted in his seat. "What about the sheriff?" Rex laughed, dry and bitter. "That coward? He'll look the other way, like he always does, and if he doesn't..." He burns with the rest. Across town, in a shed behind the old feed store, John met with a man named Travis. Travis used to ride with the Serpents until last week. After the mill incident, he packed a duffel and walked out without looking back. He didn't owe anyone anything, least of all John, but something in the way John listened made him speak. "He's cracked," Travis said, voice low. "He's gonna torch the whole square. Kids, old folks, everyone. Doesn't matter. He thinks if he scares them bad enough, they'll fall back in line." John didn't flinch. He just asked, "When? Saturday? Market day?" John nodded. "Then we have work to do." That night, he moved through the town quietly, leaving tools and instructions where they were needed. He rerouted signal wires near the cell tower on Pine Ridge, jamming the gang's radio frequency. He planted short-range interference near the square, enough to make any remote detonators useless. He found the crates the Serpents had stashed under the bleachers behind the community hall meant to be filled with fuel and fireworks, and rewired them with pressure triggers that would snap early if tampered with. This wasn't a clean operation. It wasn't stealth in the shadows. It was war in the daylight. Saturday morning came with the scent of fresh bread and grilled sausage drifting through the square. Vendors set up their stands, children played near the fountain, and for the first time in months, Lucas stood behind a brand-new coffee cart, hand-painted in white and red. On the side, carefully lettered by a child named Molly from the school down the road, were 4 words. "Hope is served hot." Lucas poured his first cup just as the motorcycles rolled in. 12 of them, engines growling, tires crunching gravel. People froze. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. A man selling jam dropped a jar that shattered on the pavement. For a few seconds, it felt like the old days again, paralysis, dread. But then someone stepped forward. It was a teenage boy named Kyle. He moved in front of his grandma's flower stand and stood tall. He didn't have a weapon. Just his voice. "Not today." Behind him, a few others followed. The butcher, his apron still stained. The mailman, still wearing his satchel. A mechanic with oil on his hands. They formed a line, loose but unyielding. The bikers revved their engines, expecting people to scatter. But they didn't. From the other side of the square, John stepped into view. No shadows now, no mask. He walked slowly to the center, hands at his sides, gun holstered but ready. His eyes locked with Rex's as the gang leader dismounted. Rex spat on the ground and walked forward. "You think this changes anything? You think these people will remember a ghost like you?" John took one more step, steady, blood from an old cut drying along his temple. "No, but they'll remember the day they stopped being afraid." Then it began. The Serpents made the first move, pulling weapons and yelling over their own engines. But the explosives John had rigged misfired before they could be used. 2 loud pops behind the stage where Rex had planned to set off the fire. Smoke filled the square, but not from flames. Panic flickered but didn't catch. Instead, people moved. Not to run, but to resist? Kyle's mother grabbed a cart and pushed it sideways, blocking the alley entrance. A retired firefighter turned over a fruit stand to create cover. From a second-story window, someone dropped a bucket of paint on a biker trying to light a fuse. John moved fast. He wasn't there to kill. He disarmed with precision, dropped 2 men before they reached the crowd, disabled another by kicking the back of his knee and pinning his arm with a clean twist. Rex fought back with fury, his fists fast and brutal, knife in hand. The 2 clashed in the center of the square, fists landing hard, grunts of effort cutting through the chaos. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't choreographed, it was raw. Rex swung wide. John ducked, drove a punch into his ribs, and sent him staggering. Rex recovered, landed a hard jab to John's shoulder. They locked, wrestled, fell. Dust flew up around them. Finally, John pinned him against the fountain wall, knee in his chest. Rex's knife kicked away and spinning on the pavement. John didn't deliver a final blow. He reached into his coat, pulled a thick zip tie, and bound Rex's hands tight. Then he dragged him across the square, tied him to his own motorcycle, and placed a handwritten note in his pocket. "Your reign ends here. Let the law do its job, if it still has the courage." Sheriff Briggs arrived not long after. The crowd parted but didn't cheer. They watched, measured him. He saw the looks and understood what they meant. Briggs walked slowly to Rex, read the note, and this time did his job. He made the arrest. And the people of Silver Vale watched him not with fear, but with a quiet, cautious trust. For the first time in years, law had returned, not as a threat, but as a choice. The Saturday that could have ended in fire instead brought something else, quiet, lasting warmth. In the days that followed, Silver Vale felt like a different place, even if the buildings still leaned and the sidewalks still cracked beneath the weight of time. What changed wasn't what people saw, but how they stood. Windows that had stayed boarded up for years were opened again. Curtains moved with the breeze. Folks stepped out onto porches not just to watch, but to wave, to talk, to be seen. The post office reopened on weekdays, and someone even painted the benches downtown in bright blue and green. Children ran freely through the square again, laughter echoing off brick walls that had once only carried the sounds of engines and silence. The flower stand came back. So did the book truck and the woman who sold homemade soap. It wasn't about profit anymore. It was about showing up. At the center of it all was Lucas. Each morning he rolled out his cart, new, sturdy, bright. Kids helped him set it up. There was always a line now. People waited not just for coffee, but for the conversation, the nod, the feeling that something good was beginning to take root. On the wall behind his usual spot, a fresh mural appeared one morning. No one knew who painted it. It showed a man in silhouette, coat blowing in the wind, walking away across a dusty path. Underneath were words written in steady, even strokes. He didn't save us. He showed us how to save ourselves. Lucas didn't talk much about what happened. He didn't need to. But if someone asked how he kept showing up through it all, he'd shrug, hand them a warm cup, and say, "You don't stop feeding what gives people hope." He never charged the kids. He never turned anyone away. When asked why, he'd just smile and pour another cup. On the edge of town, just past the old water tower, John walked a dirt path alone. A canvas bag rested over his shoulder, worn from years of use. His boots stirred dust with every step, but his pace was calm, unhurried. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He hadn't come for thanks. He came because something inside him couldn't stay quiet while others suffered. And now that the work was done, he knew it was time to move on. From a distance, Lucas watched him go. He stood by the edge of the alley near the hardware store, holding the same steel thermos John had given him weeks ago, the one that had survived fire and fear. He tightened his grip on it, took a breath, and said under his breath, "Thank you, stranger. You reminded us we still matter." John didn't look back. He didn't need to. The sun was rising behind him, casting long shadows in front of his path. But the town no longer hid in those shadows. It stood up in the light. The man who once walked through Silver Vale unnoticed had left behind something more permanent than fear. He left behind a choice, and the people had taken it. They chose to speak up. They chose each other. And Lucas, the man who once was just part of the sidewalk, sometimes it doesn't take a hero with grand speeches to change a town, just someone willing to stand up when no one else will, and someone else brave enough to follow. This story reminds us that quiet strength can echo louder than any threat, and that even the smallest act of kindness like a hot cup of coffee can be the spark that wakes an entire community. But what about you? Have you ever witnessed someone challenge injustice in a quiet but powerful way? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths for more hidden tales of courage, kindness, and unexpected justice. There's always more to uncover.